Ferreira is one of Portugal's most engaging contemporary artists. Over the last 20 years, she has created an extensive body of work in which she interrogates global politics, scrutinizing the use of theories, and at times challenging accepted narratives of history and identity as witnessed in her native Mozambique. She's part of a new generation of African artists, social activists seeking to make sense of the dramatic historical shifts witnessed in their country since independence. From anti-colonial resistance to modern architecture and gender issues, her installations frequently include sculpture combined with text, semi-documentary photographs, and videos. She uses her studio to negotiate complex subject matters, and we are so delighted to have her here with us. Dr. Ferreira, welcome to Feminism Today.
Thank you for inviting me, Sophia. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Welcome. Your art engages with the history of African socialisms, but also grapples with the struggles of women. I'm thinking here about such work as Dalaba's Sol d'Exil, which explores the deeply intertwined relationship between Miriam Makeba, for example, one of the most prominent figures in the struggle against apartheid and social activism. You write, this work was inspired by historical episodes linked to colonialism, its failure, and traumas. Can you tell us about some of the traumas experienced by women during colonialism?
Well, I think the work that you are mentioning about Miriam Makeba is a particularly poignant work, and kind of ranges a whole set of moments and types of struggles that women had during colonial times. But of course, with South Africa, the definition of colonialism does kind of fall apart a little bit, because what we're talking about is really the apartheid system, which was not strictly and technically defined as colonialism, but was an extreme form of subjugation, as we all know. So Miriam's condition ranged from being impeded from working in her own country, from being forced into exile, from being impeded of returning to the country to say goodbye to her ill mother, having to make a life for herself as the work deals with in first the United States and then in Conakry. And only finally, towards the end of her life, being allowed to return home and to participate. And the result of that was obviously the fact that she took on not only her musical career, but an incredibly interesting form of political activism. And she traveled the world and Africa in order to rally support for mostly the anti-apartheid cause. As you know, she was the first African woman to speak at the United Nations, etc., etc. But there are different experiences all over Africa. I mean, one of the other works that I made concerns, for example, a poet, a woman called Ingrid Jonker, who was an Afrikaans-speaking woman. And was writing political poetry again during the apartheid times, and came from a very conservative family. In fact, her father was one of the directors of the censorship board at the time, and she was heavily ostracized by her family and literally not allowed to practice her calling for writing poetry in South Africa. And she, for example, couldn't deal with the pressures of that, and opted for a sadder ending. She walked into the sea one day and ended her life. She took her life. She didn't obviously have the courage to. But what was interesting about Ingrid is that her suffering was combined. It was an institutional political suffering due to her father, and the censorship of her poems. But there was also a much more complex situation there, which had to do with male poets with whom she fraternized. And some of these were progressive poets, but my belief is that the environment, in the 60s was very chauvinistic, even in progressive circles. And so she got entangled in a series of love affairs, unhappy love affairs, and complex emotional situations. And I think that, combined with the sort of political institutional pressure against her work, sort of reduced her confidence and led on to her eventually taking her own life. It was interesting because as a young girl growing up in Cape Town, or becoming a young adult in Cape Town, as you said earlier, I was actually born in Mozambique. Ingrid Jonker was a role model for us. It wasn't being a young white girl in Cape Town and looking for role models of people who were women that were white and had been fighting the struggle wasn't as easy as finding males. So people like Ingrid Jonker, and also because she was from Cape Town, she took her life on the seaside in an area where we all knew, or at least we imagine that's where her body was found. So it was a space that we all knew very well, and she is a particularly a symbolic figure for me. But yes, I think women's struggles during colonial times are complex and varied. From the domestic worker experience, the daily hardships of the domestic worker. A lot of women bringing up their children alone, on their own. But yes, it's not a uniform experience, and it also varies a lot because some of this, like South Africa is a fairly industrialized country, so there's during apartheid days there was a workforce that was a women's workforce in industry, whereas in countries like Mozambique, during colonial times, there were hardly any women involved in industry, or that could, be rallied into a movement, an organized institutional movement. So whereas South Africa, for example, there was a women's workers groups that were operating as an organized institution.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to stay on this point for a little bit longer. Many of your artwork seems to hang on fragments from the colonial past, as well as entanglements between former African colonies and European metropoles, with no clear distinction between past, present, and future, or between Africa and Europe. Can you talk a little bit about the ethics and politics behind your persistent interrogation of the colonial past, particularly in a work such as Messy Colonialism, hyphen Wild Decolonization?
Yeah. Yes, I think that, I guess in a way you're touching there on something that is vital to my practice. I am, but autobiographically, in a way, I am a very hybrid person. As I said before, an African born in Mozambique and reached my maturity and my education in South Africa. I was politicized in South Africa. That's where my kind of political and thinking roots are still situated. Mm-hmm. And yet I still hold the Portuguese passport as well, and I now live in Lisbon. And in many ways, I have for a long time, or ever since I started my practice really, tried to understand the relationship between the the ex-colonial powers and the countries in Africa. I mean, I have had enormous difficulty, I'm sure I'm not the only one, in understanding why it is that African countries are still struggling to organize themselves into sustainable democracies and, economically viable societies. And if you question yourself a little bit even about that, you will inevitably have to think that just the inheritance of the colonial history is so imposing and so large and so horrible that it is natural that that kind of leftover hasn't been dissolved and sorted out. So my intuition is in many ways to look at the relationship between the ex-colonizing countries and the ex-colonized African countries in order to try and sort of understand the problems that persist. And a work like Messy Colonialism really comes from, to be honest, actually, it comes from a very specific question of mine. At some point, as you start traveling through Africa and you start, for me, going to Francophone Africa quite late in life, and I obviously had a fair idea of what British colonialism had done from having lived in South Africa for such a long time. And I had a fairly good idea of what Portuguese colonialism had done from just being Portuguese and being Mozambican. And so all of a sudden, at one point, I asked myself, and I asked friends and colleagues of mine, what the differences were between these three sort of colonial models, and try to analyze what kind of different countries came out of these imposed system. And somehow in these discussions that I was having with people, it came out, the difference between the French colonial system and the English colonial system became much clearer to me. And then all of a sudden, I sort of came to understand that actually the Portuguese colonial system was messier. It was neither here nor there. It was taking a little bit from this role model of colonialism and that one. And I guess I was more in disgust with it because it was even messier than the others.
Well, what do you mean messier? Let's talk
messier,
about that.
Yeah, this is why I'm kind of hesitating to go into this question, because the messier in the sense that, well, I'll give you a concrete example that might help. The Portuguese have this idea that their colonialism was better than everybody else's colonialism, that they weren't as evil as the French or the English.
Okay.
And so, and this is of course not true. They were all bad in equally, and there's no measure for evil, right. And so that's just the long and the short of it. Right. But somehow, and still in the Portuguese psyche, in some corners of this society, there is still a belief that the Portuguese was a more benevolent colonialism. Mainly, I think, because there was a lot more interracial relationships and a lot more of a lot less obsession with racial purity, for example. The British were very obsessed with it, and the French were fairly obsessed with it as well. The Portuguese that wasn't much of a problem, but that doesn't mean that the methodology of ruling these countries was in any way lesser or killed less people or was less destructive in the long run. So it's in that way messy, it's where people did things in a slightly different way which could lead them to believe that maybe they weren't quite as bad as the next door neighbor, but actually they were just as vicious. And so that's where messy colonialism comes from. It is kind of like a understated mention specifically to the Portuguese colonialism, because of course the work is about a set of packing boxes that landed in this country, Portugal, after decolonization. And they landed here from the settlers that were fleeing from Africa at the time of the independences. And they were literally allowed to rot for years on the quay in downtown Lisbon. And by some weird historical irony, they were also placed just at the bottom of Portugal's biggest monuments to the discoveries.
Wow.
And of course, the Portuguese discoveries in the 15th and 16th century are in fact what led to everything that we can now call slavery, colonialism, etc., the plundering of the African continent. And so to me, it was, and that's what I mean when I started off by saying that I am often driven to looking at the relationship between Portugal, for example, and Africa and Portugal in the colonial transitions and the colonial travelings, and as you well put it, in the entanglements that resulted in, you know. So that's what I mean when I say messy colonialism on the one hand, but then a wild decolonization, like they didn't do too good on the colonial side, but then they couldn't even get their boxes in, and allowed them to rot at the so it's but of course all colonialisms were messy, really. So,
and wild.
Yes, exactly. So
I want to talk a little bit about After the End, Timing Socialism in Contemporary African Art, the 2019 exhibit at Walt Gallery in New York, where I first saw your work. And I became fast friends with Alvaro Luis Lima, who's now in the University of Florida, but he pulled me into your world. He pulled me into the world of African art. And I think, if I remember correctly, it was the first exhibit in North America to explore the aesthetic responses to African socialisms and their aftermath. How has the wave of upheaval since independence and the end of the Cold War in your native Mozambique impacted the art scene, you think?
Well, again, a complex question. Some of the artists in Mozambique were trained in what was then the countries behind the Iron Curtain, because, of course, the socialist republics, as I'm sure you know, were deeply engaged with the liberation struggles. And of course, we all know that they were doing it for their own political ends as well. But the fact is they were deeply engaged with it, not only in aiding the liberation movements with arms and money, etc., but they were also deeply engaged in the educational project of the liberated countries, or to be liberated countries. And so many of the many people left Mozambique and went to study in the GDR and in the Ukraine. Those are the two that I am more familiar with. And so, just as a very first starting point, I should just say that today still there are people in Mozambique, artists in Mozambique, who were trained in those before the Cold War ended. But so that's not the question you were putting to me wasn't exactly about that, but I always think that that's important to mention, because I think that the principles and the ideas learned by those people in those contexts must have inevitably informed them and informed their kind of modus operandum on return to Maputo and other cities. But yeah, the end. So the Mozambique is a very unique country in that there was a kind of progressive art scene even before independence, I have to say. I mean, it was a country that reunited some intellectuals, mostly people that were kicked out of Portugal during the dictatorship and during colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of formed a group of progressive people, which included writers, architects, painters, and there were some local stars as well. Malangatana Valente, who is a painter who died a few years ago, has just had a big retrospective in Chicago. But I think that so in a way, what happened with the end of colonialism and independence is that some of those artists, the white ones, some of them left. So the country was then left to create a new group of people.
Yeah.
And so the contemporary art scene in Maputo is very young by and large. It's moved by dynamic people who pulled together after the Civil War ended. So, of course, you know, after independence, there's a few years of a state of grace, and then there's a dreadful civil war that goes on until the mid-90s.
Yeah.
But by the early 2000s, there's a group of people, of which a few of those that were in the Ukraine are also part of, and they pulled together to create a contemporary art movement called Movart. And they become the dynamic forces in Mozambique in the early 21st century.
Nice.
Today, the kind of sense of contemporary art practice is much more spread. There are many, many more young artists working. Finally getting access to, for example, studying in South Africa, where there are many more art schools at university levels, and traveling with bursaries also to countries like Brazil and some European countries as well. So it's a very vital scene on the ground in Maputo. It's sort of beginning to reach an international sort of connection. In fact, last year with a group of people here in Lisbon, I edited a book called Contemporary Art from Mozambique and its Diaspora. And I have a sense that the Mozambican contemporary artists are just entering an international stage, so to speak, which has been very difficult for them to do. I'm, of course, incredibly privileged because of my living here, and hybridity has its cost and its price, but it also has its benefits. It has its privileges, and I guess I'm very much part of that as well.
What do these glimpses of unfulfilled dreams and promises of African emancipation offer to us in this neo-colonial present?
That's a difficult one. I have lots of doubts about the question you're asking, and perhaps we might, I don't know, maybe we should break it down in a little bit more, because you see the looking at climate change and what countries can achieve by putting in measures. If you're looking at that and COP26 from a European point of view, when I sit and listen to the news, as I sit in my studio in Lisbon, where you have a population which is fairly well informed and is generally up to speed with what's going on. And even that sometimes not so much. I mean, sometimes I ask my students, so do you know there's COP26 going on? And they kind of look at me terrified. I know that all they know is they've heard the name.
Yeah.
They don't actually know that much about what's going on there.
Yeah.
So that's one perspective. And then if you talk about Mozambique, and so again, I think South Africa is one issue, one way of looking at things. Mozambique is another story. The two countries are neighboring, but they're really very different.
Yeah.
And I think issues of climate change are the urgencies don't reach the population. And I also don't think they reach the government in many cases. So, it's part of the whole struggles that African countries have to deal with, for example, with corruption and not sometimes tackling issues that are more urgent. African countries and African people are the ones that are suffering the most with climate change. They're paying the price. I was even today just listening at how children in Madagascar are suffering, the 20-fold the amount of undernourished children this year in Madagascar due to drought and therefore lack of food.
Well, it's been absolute pleasure speaking with you. I thank you so much for your time, Dr. Ferreira. Thank you very much for sitting with us and taking time out of your schedule. Thank you for joining me here on Feminism Today. Join us next week for another episode of Feminism Today.